Melissa made the turnoff from the rural highway and onto the access road, which led apparently to the drainage exchange she was there to check on. There'd been a lot of flooding lately, so the county was using defunct lines to manage the overflow. Some of the lines weren't taking up all the slack that they were supposed to, so investigators like her had been sent out to assess the issues. Trouble was, there weren't a lot of investigators like Melissa, thus there were a lot of blockages and not many people to check up on them. So she was pretty busy, but she didn't mind. Getting paid to head out onto these old roads and basically go for a short hike was not only worth it to her, it was a good time. As she pulled her truck along the rough gravel access road, she noted the heavy overgrowth all around. No one had been out here in a long time, or if they had, they'd walked in from the highway. Branches and leaves were smacking the sides of the F-150 relentlessly, and she found herself slowing a bit, worried they'd crack the windshield if she wasn't careful. The foliage was so bad, she had missed the sign, which marked the location of the path to the exchange. When she finally saw it, she brought the vehicle to a stop and had a bit of a look around. There was nothing but bright lush green in every direction, including in front of her. She couldn't even see the end of the access road, and when she looked back, the highway had practically disappeared in a sea of leaves. Melissa bit her lip and shook her head as she took a deep breath. She loved nature, which is why she'd taken the job, but she didn't like how secluded the area was. Who knew what was out here and why? Not everyone was a county worker after all. The idea of running into a bunch of meth heads was a possibility, but more than that, bears were always a concern, and she didn't want to get surprised. She grimaced as she reached into her backpack next to her and took out her Springfield compact and its holster. She then got out of the truck and slipped the holster into her waistband so that it and the pistol were concealed. She wanted to have it if she needed it, but didn't want to advertise its existence. Melissa, who was more of a knife girl anyway, touched those that she carried on her from her neck knife down to the CKRT she kept in the ankle pocket above her cargo pants. All were where they should be, but none of them were helpful with her next task. So she reached into the bed of her truck and pulled out her Bushman's Pal. She'd kept the survival tool there ever since the day she had to cut through 2 feet of brambles with a 6-inch buck knife just to get a look at the valve. Blade in hand, Melissa went about the work of clearing out the foliage around her vehicle and the sign. She didn't know how far into the woods she was going to have to go, and she didn't want to get smacked in the face all the way back to her truck. After clearing enough away so as to make egress easy, but not too much damage to the trees, she sheathed the pal and took a peek into the woods. The underbrush just past the sign off the access road was heavy for a few feet, but then tapered off. Beyond that, there was the barest hint of a trodden trail, but it could just as easily been a turn of the ground that looked that way. She grimaced as she once again withdrew her bush knife to cut the back of the lower brambles and other plant life so that she could get a better look. Once within the trees, Melissa noticed that it immediately grew darker, which was not unexpected and not all that unwelcome. She took off her sunglasses to really drink in the beauty of the forest around her after she'd finished with her cutting. The birds were chirping and the trees creaked wonderfully, and she found herself feeling exceptionally grateful for her job, and not for the first time. After gazing at the green for a bit longer, she decided that it was probably about time she at least attempted the task for which she'd been sent, and tried to sort out which direction the drain exchange was in. After a moment, she spotted an orange marker flag, covered over with years of dead leaves. After clearing them all away, she searched for another, and repeated this process until she spotted one sitting right next to a drain pipe which led down a somewhat shallow incline to a pump house. "Oh, there it is," she announced to the woods as she spotted the huge main pipe. It led down the hill in a roughly sloped manner, but leveled off in a few spots, and she wondered if that wasn't the issue. She walked over to the pipe and followed it down the incline slowly, using a laser level to check each pipe section and to ensure that none of their positions had warped or shifted. She reached the bottom of the incline and found that the drainage pipe, while odd and probably in need of repair, was steeply angled enough for that not to be the issue. She had also tapped the pipe with the flat of her bush knife and knew by the sound that each section was definitely full of water, so the pipe wasn't the issue. She turned to look at the pump house and gasped when she saw it, only then getting a really good look at the thing. "Holy shit," she exclaimed in surprise as she stared wide-eyed at what she could only see now was a massive structure. It was the size of a church and seemed to have been built deep into the ground. The thing could not possibly have been built more than 70 years ago, but it felt ancient. She'd never seen anything like it, and was both intrigued and unnerved. She picked her way down to where the pipe went into the pump house and hopped over to the other side. There was a walkway at the base of the pump house building, which led to a steel staircase. The staircase itself led up to a small, narrow walkway, which led to both the main door inside and another staircase which led over a hill on the other side. With a touch of excitement, Melissa walked right up to the old rickety staircase and tested it with a shake. It seemed sturdy, so she went ahead and climbed up them. When she got to the top, she looked around the walkway and noted a railing, which overlooked a sheer drop in a rather large ditch almost 30 feet below. She thought about heading right into the pump house, but reasoned that if the problem was with the main pump, she'd need to make the walk to that way anyway. So she passed the door and made straight for the short staircase, which led off to the upper platform and over the hill on the other side of where the building was nestled. When she got to the top of the stairs, she smirked as she found a massive water main jutting out from the base of the other side of the hill and sloping even further down into the forest. She remembered from the works map that she'd read that the main led to a pretty big lake. She followed the main pump, much as she followed the drainage pipe to the pump house. But this time, going was a lot easier, as the incline was less sloped. When she finally reached the end of the main pipe, she found that while it wasn't overgrown, it was practically bone dry, and the lake that had been on the map wasn't much more than a shallow pond. She nodded as she knew that the only way that something like this could happen is if there was something wrong at the pump house. As Melissa turned to head back up to the pump house, she paused as a horrible stench hit her nostrils. It was coming out of the main pipe, and it was absolutely horrible. She covered her nose to the smell, but leaned out in front of the main to see if there was a dead animal at the mouth, or something. But there wasn't anything, which meant that the stench was either coming from further down the pipe, or from the pump house itself. With a sigh, she started back up the incline towards the pump house. About halfway there, she heard a noise in the trees off to her right, and paused to scan the area in that general direction. It had probably been an animal, but just in case, she clipped her big bush knife's sheath to her belt to make sure it was seen. In her experience, people who wanted to hurt others but know that there is a gun in play often thought to try to take it from them. Nobody ever did that with a knife. She made it back up to the pump house and went down the little staircase to the landing without any trouble. She moved over to the entrance, but paused just before she put her hand on the door, as she realized something she hadn't when she passed the area before. She hadn't had to clear any vines away or leafy foliage when she reached this area at all, and it was in direct sunlight. She paused and looked all around the pump house again, realizing that there wasn't any kind of overgrowth of any kind. Melissa stood there for a moment, remembering how much she had to clear away from around her truck and the sign, and even all that she had to clear around the marker flags. While she wouldn't have expected it to be worse than that within the forest, the pump house was practically manicured. It was as though someone had been clearing away any debris, brush, or overgrown plants. There weren't even any fallen leaves from past autumns. She put her hand over her mouth and rubbed her chin, considering the implications of it all. If someone was out here clearing everything away, then why hadn't they cleared away the branches up on the road? She wondered if they simply did not have the tools, as some of those branches by her truck would need more than a trimmer. But who would come all the way out here to clear it all back without the necessary tools? She hesitated for a moment and wondered if she should just leave. If someone was squatting in the pump house, she didn't want any trouble with whoever it was, no matter how stupid she wanted to tell them that they were. Anyone who was going to try and live out of a public works building is going to run into a problem sooner or later, when they're discovered. Then again, the building was so damned old that whoever it was might think the place was simply abandoned. It might have been after all, if the flooding hadn't been so bad this year. Melissa sighed deeply and took her keyring out of one of her many pockets to look for the utility key that would give her access to the pump house. She reasoned that, if anyone else was in there, she'd need to put that in a report, and if she didn't correctly assess the issue, they'd just send her out again. She thought briefly about simply saying that there was someone squatting in there and calling it a day, but it just didn't sit right with her. She found the right key and used it to unlock the pump house door, which, like the building itself, looked old as hell. She then pushed the door open with more ease than she had expected and shone her flashlight inside. Within was a dry concrete floor and some railings, which overlooked an opening in the floor, which she assumed was the forebay, which itself was empty, which was unusual. She pushed the door further open and stepped inside, and was almost immediately overwhelmed by the stench. It was so strong that she coughed loudly and almost threw up right there. Once she regained her faculties, she shone her flashlight down into the forebay, noting that it was bone dry, and the only way that could happen is if there was some kind of blockage between the drainage pipe and the station, which she thought she had established wasn't the case. She raised an eyebrow and wondered what could be causing a blockage big enough that it could prevent that much water from coming in. She thought maybe it was a really big animal that had found its way into the pipe and then died, then gotten caught in a steel grate inside the pump house, but reasoned that it would only have blocked the pipe for a few days. The forebay would also never be bone dry in that case, but at least partially full. She shone her flashlight around the pump house again to get a better look of the inside of the building. It was anything but typical, and had way more room to walk than most of the buildings of its type. It also had an old ornate wall sconce on each side, which were dark, and someone had put candles in all of them, which were melted. She suddenly wondered if it was just an electric issue, and started to turn back outside to look for some lines, when her light passed over something that caught her attention. There, Painted on a smooth section of the floor, right in the center of the pump house, was some kind of occult symbol. She had seen a pentagram before, and this was not quite like that, but it was enough like it to make her wish that she had not come inside the pump house. It was huge, had weird letters from another language all throughout it, and was painted in a red and brown substance, which she knew instantly was human blood. Melissa tried not to panic, but immediately pulled out her flip knife and snapped it out. The moment she did, she heard movement inside the room with her, off to her right, and bolted for the door. But a dark shadow stepped in front of it, blocking the light from outside. She didn't waste a single step and pressed on, dropping her knife low as she slipped it under the figure's knee and pulled upward as she blew past it. She heard a man grunt and then scream in pain, but didn't get a good look at whoever it was as she blasted out of the pump house. In front of her was another figure who stepped to block her path. The brightness of the outside after being in the pump house made him nothing more than a big dark shape to her, but she brought her knife up and slashed at what she hoped was his face. The attack missed, but he overcompensated his dodge and lost his balance, going over the rail, and he fell into the ditch. Melissa turned from the door and darted for the old metal staircase. From inside the pump house came multiple shouts of alarm and outrage. She ignored them as best she could, ran down the staircase, then straight immediately up the steep embankment, following the drainage pipe back the way she'd come. Behind her, many voices began howling maniacally, but she didn't bother looking back. "Get her," a woman's voice commanded from the pump house in a frenzied shriek, which was followed by even more crazed howls and manic cries. Melissa instinctively yelped at the sounds, but did her best to focus on running, and most importantly, not falling. She didn't know how many people were chasing after her, and she didn't care. Her focus was putting as much distance between herself and them as possible, and getting to her truck uninjured. When Melissa reached the end of the drainage pipe, she looked around in the direction she remembered coming from for the marker flag, but she couldn't find it. She looked in every direction, except for back the way she'd come from, but it was just gone. The screams behind and below her were getting louder, so she picked a direction that seemed right and kept running. She ran in the vague direction she thought she'd left her truck in, searching for the other marker flags as she went, but knowing she'd not find them. They'd been removed now, or covered again, and for the exact purpose preventing her from getting away. She almost started to cry when she spotted a shock of white through the green and knew it was her work truck. She sprinted the rest of the way across the road and burst from the tree line like a wild deer. She pulled out her keys and ran for the driver's side door to pull it open, but was startled at the sight of her windshield, which had been shattered. She grit her teeth and opened the door anyway, reasoning that she'd get herself to the main road at least and limp along until she could flag someone down. And that's when she looked down and noticed that her tires had been slashed. Melissa cursed as she backed away from her truck and heard the maniacs behind her screaming again. "Shit," she whispered her last word as she realized that her shout gave away her location. She didn't know what else to do, so she just took off, back up the access road in a run. But after a moment, she paused and put away her knife and took out her gun and a fixed blade survival knife that she kept on her back. Melissa could hear the people following her getting closer, and the woods made it seem like their cries were coming from behind her, and to her left towards the pump house. She started to cry then, realizing her situation, and how much worse it was than she had initially thought. She planned to cry for sure, but many hours from now, after she'd gotten far away, the tears came, regardless of her plans. "Here," a man's voice shouted from not far behind Melissa as she ran. She kept pumping her legs, but realized it would mean nothing if she was caught. She turned around and took aim at the man following her up the road, who was buck naked and wearing some kind of mask. She shouted a warning, but it was ignored, and so she fired twice and hit her target both times. The man dropped to the ground under Melissa's fire and didn't make another sound or move. She stared at him for a moment, her shots causing birds to fly, but also making the forest around her suddenly and eerily quiet. Was he dead? Had she just killed the man? She thought about trying for her phone, which definitely did not have a signal out there, but before she could process that, something burst from the tree line to her left. Whoever, or whatever it was, tackled Melissa to the ground and immediately went for her gun, which was a mistake. She found herself oddly in possession of a sudden presence of mind as she slammed her knife into the attacker's ribs and twisted. The attack caused the lunatic to panic, scream, and let go of her arm. When they did, she rolled over onto one knee, got to her feet, and kept running. She realized that, as athletic as she was, she didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, and thus it was of great relief to her when she finally reached the end of the access road. Without so much as a look back, she turned and ran all the way back the way she'd come from. She sheathed her knife and took out her phone, which, as she suspected, had no bars, so she kept running. Behind her, the screams stopped, and she hoped that meant that whoever these people were, they had decided that she wasn't worth the trouble. Finally, after what seemed like hours, she was able to flag down a car and get them to take her to a highway patrol office. There, she gave the police a detailed report of everything that had occurred, between sobs, including that she'd shot and maybe killed someone. She showed them her county credentials so that they knew she wasn't insane herself, and that seemed to lend weight to her story. Melissa had called her boss right afterwards and told him the whole story as well. He didn't believe it until she told him about the truck, which was a pretty big deal for him, but at this point was the least of her worries. The police sent out several units to the access road to search the entire area, including canine units. The trooper Melissa had given her statements to later told her that they found her work truck, which had been further vandalized and damaged. They also found the pump house but didn't find anyone there. And what's more is that they didn't find the body of the man she said she'd shot, or the person who tackled her. They found blood on the access road and the area outside the door to the pump house, but no sign of any persons, living or dead. After the scenes had been processed, Melissa's boss sent out a crew to check on the pump house and to figure out the problem. What they found had unnerved her more than anything that the police had told her about the case. The reason the line was not working wasn't a blockage or a malfunction. The pump house had been shut off. These people weren't squatting out there, and they weren't hiding. They were waiting, and she quit the next day.